Okay. I have to start, of course, by saying that the limud should be Le'ilu Nishmat Avi Mori Dov Ber Meir Ben Ruven Halevi Imi Marati Brachel Bat Harav Michael. And this week also Le'ilu Nishmat Meir Leib Ben Ruvain, Rhonda's father, whose yahrzeit was on Shabbat, the day, fourth day of Tevet. So away we go. Um, the parsha of Vayigash, which we will have the privilege of reading this Shabbat, is begins with Yehuda's plea to Yosef. And I wanted to focus tonight on Yehuda, and I'm going to go back to a number of different events in the life of Yehuda. And I think I want to basically going to contrast Yehuda and Yosef. We always talk about Yosef as being Yosef, of course, the dreamer. Yosef, the one whose whole life seems to revolve around dreams. And I'm going to contrast that with Yehuda, who I will say is the pragmatist. If we look through a number of the events where Yehuda is actively involved in what's going on, he seems to always be taking a very pragmatic role and position and perspective. And I'm going to try to show that, and as once again by sharing my screen and sharing what what Yehuda himself has to say as he goes through a number of different events in his life. So we're going to try to do that. Can you all see my screen now? My spread, my psukim
Yep,
here.
yep, yep,
And
yep.
we're basically going back to the first story. Really goes back to the story where Yosef is sold. And again, I've highlighted these are all Yehuda himself speaking. In all of these discussions that we're going to have tonight, all of the quotes that we're going to have tonight pretty much are going to revolve around Yehuda saying something relating directly, of course, to the situation at hand. So if we start with the first statement here, which is Parak Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Chaf Vav, Yehuda, the brothers are trying to figure out what to do with Yosef to resolve the quote Yosef problem. At least it says Vayomer Ish Elochiv. One says to his brother, "Let's kill him." Reuben says, "Let's not kill him. Let's just throw him into the pit." He shows up. They take off his coat and they throw him in the pit. And at that point, they see this caravan coming in the distance, and suddenly Yehuda speaks up. Now, Yehuda has not said anything or participated up until this point. As a matter of fact, this is really the first time we have Yehuda mentioned by name as an individual since he's been born. First time we have him is named here as being active and being involved. And he says to his brothers, what will we gain? What do we gain by killing him and covering his blood? Let's instead, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and and then we've solved our problem, and we haven't done anything personally to harm him. We haven't directly harmed him. We've moved him out of the way so that he can no longer bother us. So in other words, this is a perfect solution to the problem. Again, on the one hand, we don't want to kill him. On the other hand, we don't want him around. So let's just find a way to get rid of him. And that's again, as I said, a very direct solution, a very pragmatic solution to a problem that's been bothering them. And clearly, seemingly, everybody says, okay, sounds good, because the two words that finish Pasuk Chav Zayin are very simply by Yishmeu Echav. The brothers hear it and accept it and are ready to carry out and to take Yehuda's advice in moving forward to resolve the situation. Again, as I said, Yehuda is clearly at this point has not been the first to speak up. He wasn't he didn't get involved until he felt the discussion or there was something that he could contribute. And as such, as long as things are going along, he doesn't get involved, but he gets involved when he feels he has to get involved to move something in a different direction. And that's what we're going to see as, I guess, one of the characteristic traits of Yehuda is that he is going to he's going to wait for the right opportunity to come forward with a suggestion, and ultimately we're going to find that more times than not his suggestion is going to be carried out and is going to going to be, I will guess, say the vote, the suggestion that gets followed, and that people are able to, I guess, live with. So from that perspective, Yehuda clearly shows a very different leadership style than Yosef, a very different personality style than Yosef. Yosef, as I say, the dreamer. Yehuda, the actor, the pragmatist, is what I think I've said. Okay. The next story then we have in Perek Lamed Chet, after Yosef has been sold, it tells us that Yehuda goes and
But
he gets. I'm sorry,
Aaron,
Elliot, you had a question?
but 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 Yosef, I mean, we call him a dreamer, but really in practice, he's very much a halacha lemaisa person. He it's not just that someone who's normally, when we think of someone as a dreamer, we think someone who is very I don't know, maybe artsy, or someone whose head is in the clouds.
I'm
But
not
he
going to
was a person
suggest
who
that
took their
Yosef's
dreams
head
and
is
made
in the
them.
clouds. I tend to agree. I don't mean a dreamer in that sense that his head is in the clouds. I think he's a dreamer in the fact that he is always looking for a possibility that that may not actualize or be actualized immediately, as opposed to, as I said, Yehuda, who's always looking for seems to be, at least as we look through the different things we're going to see, Yehuda is always focused on the immediate problem and the immediate solution, as opposed to Yosef, who seems to be much more. And I say, when I say dreamer, I would say the difference between perhaps a long range thinker and a short range planner. Okay, because Yosef is looking out way out into the future. He's a kid and he's already dreaming about what's going to be somewhere down the road, whereas Yehuda is always looking at the problem directly at hand and let's resolve it now. And whether he's looking at the long-term impact, we don't know. We really can't tell. I mean, go back again to the first story. What's the long-term impact of selling Yosef to these Ishmaelites? We have no idea. He may resurface. We don't know when, how, and where he's going to resurface. Yuda's not concerned with that at this point. At this point, I have an immediate issue. I want to deal with it. Let's try to deal with it in the most effective way for today. And what happens tomorrow, we'll worry about tomorrow. Okay. Yuda's not looking for a long-term solution. That's when I say a pragmatist as opposed to the dreamer. The dreamer, the one who's got this much longer range, longer term thought process, not necessarily someone who's got their head in the clouds, although I think to an extent Yosef does have his head in the clouds. um you know um Although there are points in the Yosef story where clearly he is focused on the now. I mean, when he's in front of Paro, he is thinking about how he is going to present this dream interpretation in such a way that it is compelling that Paro is going to have to do something about it. um, and that drives him toward the direction he wants to go. But if we look at it, for example, when he's interpreting the dreams for the butler and the baker, he's not really thinking about I mean, he's giving them their information, but he's not thinking about what impact is this going to have on me for today. He's more focused again. Kim Zachartani Itcha, somewhere in the future you'll remember me and something will come of this. I don't know when it'll be. In other words, he's looking more out rather than an immediate answer. The immediate thing he's doing is, yes, he's interpreting the dreams, but for himself, he's not thinking per se about an immediate response, as opposed to where I said Yehuda seems to always be focusing on something that an immediate need, plan, an immediate issue that's been raised. Okay. Does that help, Elliot? Elliot, is that okay? You okay?
Yes,
All right.
yes, it does.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Um, so we go now to the story of Yehuda and his sons and Tamar. So again, as I said, I've left out a number of the psukim because I'm focusing on the things that Yehuda is saying in response to a certain situation. So in Pasuk Zion, we read about how Er dies, and in Pasuk 8, Yehuda comes to Onan and says, "Go marry your brother's wife and become her yavam." In other words, marry her. Because this is now your responsibility. Again, there's an issue here. There's a widow. There's a brother who's still alive. You have to take that initiative, Yehuda tells him. Now, again, it backfires in this case. Onan is not willing to take Yehuda's suggestion, and he doesn't. And therefore, Hashem punishes him by death also. But then in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Yehuda says, I now have another problem. I have had two sons who've died. Is this Tamar? Is it Tamar's fault or is it their fault? I don't know, but I don't want to take a chance with my third son because now I only got one son left. So he immediately says, Shvi almana beit avich. He tells her, this is his solution. You go home, and when Shayla gets older, we'll deal with it. So in other words, I need a solution to the immediate problem. I don't know what the long range effect is going to be, but I need to resolve this problem today, and this is my solution, and this is what we want to do. Again, ultimately, when he meets Tamar, again, it's the same thing. It's here's an issue, here's something I need, here's a solution. And again, we go through this again, Yehuda constantly focusing on here's the immediate solution, here's what we need to do, and here's how we'll get over it. Ultimately, at the end, when he finds out that she is, when Tamar is pregnant, Yehuda again, immediately in Pasuk Chav Dalet, has a solution. Vayoma Yehudahu ti'uha v'tisaref. Take her out and she should be burned. Again, it appears that as the Shomeret Yavam, as the one who is waiting for Shelah, she is bound to him and is not supposed to be sleeping with anybody else. And again, Yehuda again is thinking of a solution, and he finds an immediate solution is that she has to be punished for her action. And it's only later on when she tells Yehuda, oh, by the way, you know who the father is. You know who the father is. I'm not telling anybody else. And then it says, Vayomer tzad kabimeni. Immediately he again responds, she's right. I wrong decision. Got to change the decision here. Okay. Somebody pointed out to him why his decision was wrong. He changes his decision and we move forward. Again, Yehuda, as I said, always looking for a way to deal with the situation as it comes up. And as a result, he doesn't, it seems as if, as we look at the psukim, that he doesn't always look at a full long range, every impact that possibly could come out of this. And again, in terms of being a leader, oftentimes we need to have that immediate response, because if we don't respond immediately, something else will take over priority, and we won't get to dealing with this issue, and we need to. So this is an important characteristic, that we have to be able to look at a situation, analyze it, and come up with a solution before it gets out of hand. And I think that's one of the things that we see very, very much in Yehuda as we go through these stories. We're going to go now to the story again, because then after the story with Tamar and the two twins, we go back to Yosef. We don't hear anything about Yehuda again until Perek Mem Gimel. Mem Gimel, in Perek Mem Bet, we are told that Yaakov sends his sons, 10 of his brothers, down to get food. They get food, they come home, and now now Yaakov wants them to go back again. And suddenly, again, Yehuda is now first and foremost coming to his father to say, wait a minute, there's a problem, and here's the solution. Okay. So if we look at Pasuk Gimel, which is, I mean, again, Pasuk Aleph tells us that the famine keeps going. They fuse up all the food. Yaakov tells them to go down again. And suddenly Yehuda speaks up and says to his father and says the following: we have a problem. You don't understand this. You want us to go down, but there's a problem that you have to be aware of. We can't go, and we look at Pasuk Dalet, and hey, Yehuda spells it out very clearly. If you send Binyamin, we're ready to go. If you don't, we can't go. That's the solution. So now my solution is you have to send Binyamin with us. Okay. Otherwise, we're at a dead end here. And if you want us to go, we want to go, but we can't go without Binyamin because that's the condition that was placed upon us when we left. Yaakov says, what's going on here? How did and the brothers? Now it's interesting in verse 6. Yaakov asks, how come you had to tell him that you have another brother? And they all answer. He asked us all these questions, and here's what, and we told him, we were honest with him. Did we know he was going to tell us to bring a brother down? And suddenly, before Yaakov has a chance to answer that, Yehuda says, "Okay, I have a solution. The solution is very simple. I'm going to take responsibility for Binyamin, and because we have to go, there's no choice here." Again, he's taking a very, very simple approach. If we stay here, we're all going to eventually die of the famine. We have to get to Egypt to get the food. The only way we can get to Egypt to get the food is if Binyamin is with us. And the only way I'm offering you an opportunity here to allow Binyamin to go, I will take responsibility for him. And again, and it's not just responsibility, it's a very, very personal, deep responsibility of this concept of in verse 9, Anochi ervenu. It's like I am completely and fully responsible. And Arev in halacha is a cosigner of a debt. I mean, if anything happens to this, I will ensure that he comes back safely, or I will have sinned to you all my days. And again, he follows it up with another verse by saying, hey, we must do this immediately. If we hadn't delayed all this time, we could have been there and back already numerous times. So we need to do this. Again, as I said, a very pragmatic approach. This is what we need to do. This is how we're going to do it. And now it's time to do it. And in verse 11, the rest of that story, very simply, is clearly Yaakov agrees. They send Binyamin. And now we find that at the end of the next chapter, Parak Mem Dalid, Binyamin has been accused of stealing the goblet. And again, we have a very interesting pasuk here, because in pasuk Yud Dalid, which I haven't highlighted, I'm highlighting it now if you can see it. It says, "Vayavo Yehuda v'yachav beita Yosef." Yehuda and his brothers come to Yosef's house, and it seems very, very strange. This is the first time in the entire story between Yosef and the brothers where Yehuda is singled out. Why Why doesn't it just say that they're all brought to Yosef's house? Why is suddenly Yehuda singled out? I think that's a very, very a telltale sign. The Torah, the narrator, if you will, Kaviyachol, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is telling us, because clearly the person who brought the brothers to Yosef's house didn't single Yehuda out and say, Yehuda and his brothers, come with me. He said, all of you, come on, let's go. We're going back. Okay. So suddenly the Torah is putting this emphasis on Yehuda as he is now going to take the lead role in what is going to ensue. It's going to be Yehuda on one side of the aisle and Yosef on the other side. And the two of them are going to be engaged in a dialogue that's going to take us through the rest of this Parak Mem Dalet. Okay, with most of it, by the way, being Yehuda speaking. Okay, so Yosef greets them as they get to the house and say, how could you have doing that? Didn't you realize I was going to realize you stole the cup? And Yehuda says, what can we say? We know, and he does not admit their guilt. He says, God has found a way to repay us for our sin. Hinenu avadim ladini, we will be slaves to you and all of us, including the one who the cup was found with. And Yosef says, no, only the one whose the cup was found will be my servant. You can go back home. And suddenly now we begin this week's parsha of Vayigash. All of this up till now was all giving us some background on who Yehuda is. And suddenly now at the beginning of this week's parsha, Yehuda, who as I said, has had a number of points where he's gotten up and spoken, and ultimately his suggestion generally is accepted. We now come to this story. This is perhaps, as I said, one of the longest monologues in the entire Torah. I guess the only one that comes comparably that compares to it is, of course, the story of Eliezer, where he's relating his entire story to Rivka's family. Other than that, we rarely have such a long monologue in the Torah where one person is speaking, and the entire purpose of Yehuda's speech, which takes up an entire 14, 15, 16 psukim, is found here all the way at the bottom, is where he finally makes his suggestion right here. Let me highlight it, which should have been highlighted. I thought I had highlighted it right here, where he says very simply at the end of this whole story, he says, I am willing to stay here and be your servant instead of Binyamin, so that he can go home with his brothers. That's the whole point, the whole climax of Yehuda's entire speech here. And in theory, if it weren't for the fact that the Torah records this whole thing, we would have said, wait a minute, why is the Torah going through this whole long speech here of Yehuda? Why doesn't it just say, okay, and Yehuda said something, you said this to Yosef, and Yosef reveals himself? The fact of the matter is, this entire monologue, this entire entreaty of Yehuda is there for the purpose of arousing compassion in this Egyptian leader. Now remember, Yehuda may or may not know who he's speaking to. I would suspect that he had no idea he was speaking to Yosef. Others may disagree and may think that he did, but my personal opinion is that he had no idea that this Egyptian ruler was Yosef, and he fully expected at the end of this thing the ruler to either say yay or nay, and he was hoping it to touch the ruler's emotion in such a way that the answer would be yay. He didn't try to think about what happens after that. That was not his concern. His concern right now is number one problem. I have to get Binyamin home. I promised Abba I'd get him home. Whether I show up with him or not doesn't matter. He has to get home. And as such, I have to do everything in my power to make sure that he gets home, because that's what I promised Abba I would do. And he pulls out basically every possible way that he can play on this ruler's emotions to try to get him to feel compassion for this young son. And it's interesting because when Binyamin first shows up before Yosef, Yosef says, "Hazach ichem hakaton." This is your younger brother. He's an old guy. He's 30 years old already. I thought you were talking about a 6-year-old the way you're talking about your younger brother. Binyamin's already, a full-grown man, 10 kids, full family, and yet Yehuda, by using certain terminology, is very, very clearly playing on the emotional aspect of Yaakov's attachment for this child, for this young man, in order to give this leader, every reason to show compassion for him, because that's his goal. His target is to convince this leader that he should show compassion and allow Binyamin to go home. I think, as I said, if we look at the way Yehuda approaches this whole speech here, it's again very, very similar to the way he's approached everything. I have an immediate problem. I have a solution. I need to convince somebody else that this is the correct solution, and in doing so, I will have achieved what needs to be achieved. I'm not worried about what happens after or not. And I think that whole focus we see throughout all of these stories with Yehuda. And I think that's the leadership lesson that Yehuda is teaching us here, is that we have to be able to come up with a solution that will work. And that doesn't mean we can ignore all of the downstream impacts of it, but we have to realize that every day there are going to be situations that come up that have to be dealt with, that we can't just sit there and say, okay, let's leave them and ignore them and they'll go away. And we have to come up with creative, appropriate solutions that will work. And we have to implement those solutions and be willing to get behind those solutions. And I think the ultimate is, and we have to trust in Hashem for the long term, that these will have a long-term beneficial effect. And obviously, again, I'm not going to suggest that Yehuda would have taken courses that would be destructive over the long term. All I'm saying is that Yehuda is much more than Yosef per se, much more focused on the short term, on making sure that the short term works, and leaving the long term, his trust in Hashem for managing the long term. And I think that's borne out by all of these psukim and the way that Yehuda interacts and interrelates with the brothers, and certainly with his father as well as with Yosef. So I hope that I made my point, and at this point I will throw out the gauntlet and say any questions, comments, or feedback at this point. Anybody? Okay, going once, twice.
No, thank you very much. Shkoyach.
Okay,
Have
so
a good
have a
evening.
good rest of the week, all,
Great.
and